Swimming in the Rain by Juliet's Emo Phase. The party was too loud, and no one seemed to notice when Harry slipped out between the French doors into the night. His head was ringing, and he was sick of the champagne he'd been forced yet again into drinking. He pulled out his wand and transfigured it into water, taking a long gulp before melting into the shadows, letting the din of the crowd drift away behind him. Now he was out in the cool air with a bit of peace and quiet. His pounding headache was already subsiding, and he took a long, deep breath to calm himself as he wandered between the topiary. Harry hated these gatherings. All he'd wanted after Voldemort's demise was to try and reclaim some sort of normal life, focus on his aura training, attempt to rekindle his relationship with Ginny. But his career had been put on hold, and his love life had fizzled out, leaving only this insufferable string of PR events that seemed unending, both in their frequency, but also in their monotonous, repetitive nature. He'd lost track of whatever mansion he was at now, or even who was hosting this charity gala in honor of the boy who lived. Wherever he went now, every week or two, he was expected to give the same old speech, drink with the same old people, smile until his face ached, and pretend like everything was fine. Hermione and Ron felt the same, he knew. But they had each other now, and Harry had to respect their blossoming courtship because he loved them. Even when they made gooey eyes across the table, and he felt like jamming spoons into his eyes. He sighed and drained the last of his water from the champagne flute. He wished he had more, but a light drizzle was starting to fall, giving the air a moist taste that managed to wet his tongue a little. He didn't know where he was going, but he was happy to be away from the throng at least, alone with his own thoughts. That was until he turned the corner and he came across the most bizarre sight. It seemed like he wasn't the only one who decided to ditch the party and wander the grounds. A figure he recognized almost immediately as Draco Malfoy was stood by the edge of a large kidney-shaped swimming pool, trailing a bare foot through the rain-spotted waters. His other foot was shoeless too, as was his chest under his unbuttoned black shirt. In one hand, he held a champagne glass just like Harry's, although his still had alcohol in it, and in the other he shielded himself against the drizzle with a large black umbrella. Harry wasn't sure why he was so put out by seeing his former school nemesis. He was trundled out to all those events as well, after all. But normally there was a crowd between them. Loud music, dinner tables, more clothes. As if hearing his thoughts, Draco looked up and grinned, sloshing his toes through the water again. "Hello, Harry," he said with a grin, and took another swig of bubbles. He obviously wasn't as sick of it as Harry was. Judging from the warm pink flush on his cheeks, he'd probably had several glasses already. "Come to escape as well?" Harry blinked, little rain droplets clinging to his eyelashes. Despite seeing him all the time, Harry wasn't sure he and Draco had spoken since he and his mother had thanked him after speaking at their trials. "You don't want to be alone?" he said, coming a little closer. "Psh!" responded Draco, swinging his umbrella in an arch, resulting in an arch of rain splattering across the patio. Draco was obviously not all that concerned about keeping dry, and his white blonde hair glistened in the lamplight from a fine layer of rain it had built up. "I'm always alone. You're possibly the only one who hates this nonsense as much as me. So let's be bored together." He winked at Harry and dragged his foot along the surface of the pool again. "You noticed that too, huh?" he said, coming closer again. There was only a few feet of space between them now, filled with silently drifting rain. Draco licked his lower lip and considered Harry properly. "Yeah," he said, pondering. "But you probably could skiv off and no one would mind. You're the chosen one, after all." He said Harry's new title with such a loftiness that Harry couldn't help but grin. "You don't seem as impressed at me as everyone else," he teased, but Draco's grey eyes stilled on him. "Quite the contrary," he said softly, splashing his foot through the waters again. He gave a little wobble, and Harry started forward on instinct, but Draco righted himself quick enough and laughed. "Were you about to rescue me?" he asked, with a devilish flick of the eyebrows. Harry cleared his throat. "I'm sure you can handle yourself," he said evenly. "Though I'd rather not have to try and explain to your father how you drowned in an international Quidditch stars pool." "Ah," said Draco. "Daddy dearest wouldn't like that. Not after all the hard work he's put into making me the poster child for the Malfoys' redemption." He grimaced and dipped the other toes in. Who else would he drag to these infuriatingly sham-ridden galas? Mother wouldn't have any of it. She's got enough sense to show contrition and have some respect. "You don't think you've redeemed yourself?" Harry asked, curious. Just because he'd never spoken to Draco over these past few months doesn't mean he hadn't seen him. His face had been guarded and hard to read at the beginning, when the Ministry had initially come up with the genius thought that by touring the country and celebrating the return to normalcy, spirits would be bolstered and old grievances gradually put aside. But as they happened more and more, that old familiar Malfoy steel had come back to Draco's gaze. This time, though, unlike their first few years at school, it wasn't arrogance keeping that medal in his composure, but more the determination of a survivor. Harry was witness as Draco had taken those terrible years of his service to Lord Voldemort, tucked it in his pocket, and finally held his head up high to make something more of his new life. It suddenly struck Harry, stood by that pool, he really had been paying an awful lot of attention to Draco Malfoy. And at some point, he'd simply become Draco. He wasn't sure he wanted to analyze too closely what that was about. Draco sighed. "I don't know if I can ever come back from what I did," he said, the humor gone from his voice. He took another gulp of champagne, almost draining the glass, his toes still curled around the lip of the swimming pool. "But I'm not going to let it ruin my life." He shook his head and jutted his chin towards the manor house they'd come from. "That is, once they stop making me go to these things every other day, and I can actually start having a life." Harry chuckled. "Tell me about it," he agreed. "It's just to make themselves all feel better, like it never happened. I'd rather face up to the terrible truth and focus on building a new and better world." "You should put that in your next speech," Draco encouraged, with a little smirk. "They might actually listen if it came from you." He knocked his head back and swallowed the last of his drink. Unfortunately, though, with his foot back in the pool, and the alcohol undoubtedly affecting his coordination, he suddenly overbalanced himself and went crashing into the water, the umbrella sprawling after him. Harry didn't think, other than perhaps to remember his earlier comment about not wanting to explain to Lucius Malfoy why his only hero had met his demise in a moonlit swimming pool. His robes and shoes were off before he could even process what he was doing, and he jumped into the pool after Draco, seizing his shirt and dragging him spluttering back into the night air. He coughed and flailed his arms, eventually treading water and shaking his hair from his eyes. "Blimey, Harry," he said, as the umbrella drifted open and upside down beside them. "You've really got a thing for saving me, haven't you?" It could have been a tease, but there was something smoldering behind his eyes that made Harry's stomach flip a little. "Well," said Harry, glad his glasses were water-repellent and that he could still see, "I didn't fancy facing all those sycophants by myself. I think I can always rely on you for an honest opinion." "You want my honest opinion?" Draco asked. They could have easily moved to the shallow end, or gotten out of the water altogether, but for some reason Harry felt rooted, bobbing in the water that extended just below his feet. He gulped. Did he want the honest opinion of Draco Malfoy? "Sure," he said, feeling brave. He was a Gryffindor, after all. Draco was serious again. You're too good for them. For this. You shouldn't let them boss you around or work you like a puppet. They weren't around when you were fighting you-know-who. But the way they act... He snarled in disgust. It's like it was their plan all along. You should tell them to shove their stupid speeches and start getting on with your life for the first time. Harry was a little dumbstruck. It seemed like Draco had been thinking about him just as much as he'd been thinking about Draco. You think they'd let me? He asked honestly. Draco swam a little closer. You're Harry Potter. No one has to let you do anything. Harry's skin was tingling, and it wasn't just due to the chilly water. Your opinion of me certainly changed, he said, hoping he wasn't going to shatter the moment by bringing up the past. But Draco shrugged and smiled. He was right in front of Harry now, as close as they could be without their paddling limbs touching. Saving a guy's life will do that. It might make him realize how much of an idiot he's been, or maybe what's been right in front of him this entire time. And what's that? Harry asked, his heart thumping. You, replied Draco, without hesitation. Just you, Harry. It's always been you. Harry wasn't sure what to think, but his eyes were wide and a shiver ran down his spine. I guess, he said, brain catching up with his body. It's always been you too. He tentatively wrapped his fingers around the shirt material bellowing in the water around Draco's body and pulled him a little closer. What was he doing? His brain screamed at him. What he should have done a long time ago, he finally realized. He leaned in, touching his lips to Draco slowly, giving him the chance to pull away if he misread the signs and this wasn't really what he wanted. But he was rewarded with a sweet kiss back, with hands in sopping wet hair and bodies pulled together against Harry's thin shirt. Draco was warm and solid and just so right, and as they pulled apart, panting slightly, Harry couldn't help but smile as the joy he was feeling coursed through his blood. It's always been you, he told him again. Just you, Harry, Draco agreed.